Welcome to our deep dive into the fascinating world of nonverbal communication. We're going to unlock the secrets hidden in plain sight using Gerard I, Nierenberg's How to Read a Person Like a Book. You might be surprised to learn that Nierenberg wasn't a psychologist. His expertise comes from negotiation training, and he got deep into body language because he wanted to crack the code of how it impacts communication, especially in those high-stakes deal-making moments.
It's so fascinating how his background shaped his approach. He wasn't content with just theorizing. Nierenberg was all about real-world observation. He actually recorded over 2,500 negotiation scenarios looking for patterns in people's gestures.
That's incredible. Talk about a data-driven approach. So 2,500 negotiations later, what did he learn? Was it all about interpreting every little twitch and eye roll? Yeah.
Actually, Nierenberg found that the key to accurately reading someone isn't about isolated movements. It's about looking for clusters of gestures, what he calls gesture clusters. It's like reading a sentence versus just looking at individual words. The cluster gives you the full context. Imagine you're in a meeting and a colleague says they agree with the plan, but they're frowning, arms crossed, and leaning away from the table. Those conflicting signals, that's a gesture cluster telling you there's more to the story.
Okay, that makes total sense. So we need to be gesture detectives looking for these groups of cues. Now, Nierenberg dives into specific categories of body language, and one that really stood out to me was openness versus defensiveness. This seems so relevant to everyday interactions, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Think about those simple actions like unbuttoning a coat. Nierenberg observed that this can signal a willingness to be open, a receptiveness to what's being discussed. He even had a great anecdote about this from a business negotiation he observed in Jamaica. When the participants started shedding their jackets, it signaled they were ready to come to an agreement despite the heat.
It's fascinating how a simple act, like removing a coat, can be such a powerful signal. So if someone is open, they might unbutton their jacket, lean forward, maybe even mirror your posture.
Exactly. But on the flip side, if someone is feeling defensive, they're more likely to cross their arms, clench their fists, maybe even grip their chair tightly. Nierenberg observed that a distinctly American version of this is the figure 4 leg cross, where one ankle rests on the opposite knee. So you're in a meeting and you see that figure 4 leg cross combined with clenched fists. That's a pretty strong signal that the person is feeling resistant or closed off.
Now, this makes me think about how we interpret those evaluation gestures, the kind of body language that suggests someone is deep in thought. I'm thinking about the classic thinker pose with hand on cheek and head tilted. Is this always a good sign, or can it be misread?
That's a great question. You're right that thinker pose is a classic evaluation gesture, but Nierenberg points out that these gestures can be tricky to interpret. The thinker pose, for example, is often mistaken for boredom or disinterest when it actually signals deep concentration.
That's really interesting. So how can we tell the difference? What should we look for in addition to the hand-on-cheek pose?
Well, Nierenberg talks about this fascinating observation he made while watching a seminar with 50 executives. He noticed that all those different hand-to-face positions, the chin stroke, the forehead rub, actually correlated with their levels of engagement. It wasn't about one specific gesture, but rather the subtle variations in how they touched their faces.
So someone stroking their chin might be pondering a point, while someone rubbing their forehead could be signaling frustration or confusion. I love how we can start applying these observations to our own interactions.
It's like becoming a body language detective, but Nierenberg also cautions us about something he calls overloading.
Have you ever been in a situation where you're bombarded with information and you just can't take it in anymore?
Oh, absolutely. I think we've all been there. What happens then? Does our body language change? It definitely does. Nierenberg describes how people start switching off nonverbally. They might straighten up in their chair, then slouch back, glance at the ceiling, their watch, other people in the room. And eventually their whole body starts orienting towards the exit.
Oh, wow. I can totally picture that. So we can actually see someone's interest level waning just by observing those subtle shifts in posture and gaze. This has given me a whole new perspective on meetings and presentations.
It really does change how you perceive those interactions, doesn't it? But there's another category of gestures that Nierenberg delves into that I find particularly intriguing: suspicion and secretiveness. This is where things get really interesting.
Okay, I'm all ears. So how can we spot someone who's being less than truthful or maybe holding something back?
Well, Nierenberg talks about this concept of left-handed gestures. It's not a foolproof method, of course, but he noticed that gestures made with the left hand can sometimes betray hidden thoughts or feelings. It goes back to the idea that the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body and vice versa, so the left hand might be more connected to our subconscious impulses.
That's fascinating. So if someone is covering their mouth with their left hand while they're speaking, could that be a sign they're trying to conceal something?
It could be. Nierenberg shares this anecdote about a colleague who kept covering his mouth with his left hand during a meeting. Turns out he was hiding his true opinion, which was totally different from what he was saying out loud. It's a real cautionary tale about the power of nonverbal communication.
Wow, I'm starting to see the world in a whole new light. It's amazing how much we can learn about someone just by observing their body language. But this is just the beginning, right? There's so much more to uncover in Nierenberg's book. It really is like having a secret decoder ring for understanding people. So we've talked about openness, defensiveness, evaluation, even suspicion. What other fascinating insights did Nierenberg uncover in his research?
Well, he also delves into the concept of readiness, which is really interesting. It's not just about aggression, but more about that focused, goal-oriented energy you might see in someone who's ready to take action. Think of a sprinter in the starting blocks, completely poised and ready to launch forward.
Okay, I can picture that. What would that look like in a more everyday setting?
Nierenberg says you might see someone sitting on the edge of their chair, hands on their thighs, body leaning forward. They're engaged, alert, ready to jump into the conversation. Think of a salesperson about to close a deal. They're practically vibrating with anticipation.
But wait. Couldn't that same posture also mean someone's about to make a run for the door? Especially if the sales pitch isn't going so well.
That's such a good point. Context is everything. The same gesture cluster can have totally different meanings depending on the situation. That salesperson on the edge of their seat, they could be eager to hear yes, or desperate to escape a disastrous meeting. So you really have to read the room, pay attention to those subtle cues, and consider the whole picture.
This is so helpful. It's reminding me to be more mindful of both my own body language and the signals other people are sending. Now, I'm curious about something Nierenberg calls reassurance gestures. These seem particularly relatable, wouldn't you say? We all have those moments where we need a little comfort or a boost of confidence.
Absolutely. And Nierenberg had this brilliant observation about how people react when they see themselves on video for the first time. Most people are horrified, right? They see every little flaw magnified. And that's when those self-soothing gestures come out.
Oh, tell me about it. The thumb rubbing the cuticle. Even putting an object in your mouth. Like you need a shield from the awkwardness. I've definitely been there.
Haven't we all? It's like we instinctively reach for something to comfort ourselves in those moments of self-consciousness. He even did this experiment where he gave coffee to people watching themselves on video. And many of them unconsciously used the cup as a barrier between themselves and the screen.
Wow, that's so fascinating. It's like our bodies have a language of their own, trying to soothe us when we're feeling vulnerable. But of course, not all emotions are as subtle. What about those times when we're feeling frustrated or even angry? How does that manifest in our body language?
Nierenberg doesn't hold back when describing those pent-up gestures of annoyance and irritation. He gives this vivid example of baseball legend Joe DiMaggio, who would often make a little kicking motion with his foot whenever he was robbed of a hit. It was this subtle, almost involuntary expression of frustration.
It's amazing how even the slightest gestures can reveal those inner emotions we're trying to keep under wraps. So besides the DiMaggio kick, what are some other signs that someone's frustration is bubbling to the surface?
Well, you might notice short, rapid breaths, almost like snorting. And then there are the clenched fists, especially when paired with pointing. It's like they're holding back a punch.
Okay, that's definitely a sign to maybe steer clear. Now, on a more positive note, what about those gestures that convey confidence and authority? I'm picturing that classic power pose, chest out, shoulders, back, chin held high.
You got it. Nierenberg talks about how erect posture, prolonged eye contact, and minimal blinking can all project confidence. And then there's this fascinating gesture called steepling.
Steepling. Is that when someone brings their fingertips together, almost like they're forming a church steeple with their hands? I've seen people do that, but I never knew what it meant.
That's exactly it. And here's the interesting part. The higher the steepling, the greater the confidence. You might see someone steepling at eye level like they're looking at you through their hands. That's a power move for sure.
It's like they're saying, I'm in control here. So if I start steepling during my next presentation, will that make me seem more confident?
Well, it's not quite as simple as that. It's not just about mimicking gestures. It's about understanding the underlying emotions and intentions they convey. Nierenberg also points out that confident people tend to be more relaxed in their overall body language. They don't fidget as much or rely on those self-soothing movements. Their calmness comes through in their posture and gestures.
That makes sense. So it's about finding that balance between projecting confidence without seeming too rigid or forced. Now, what about the flip side of confidence? What are some of those telltale signs of nervousness? I think we've all experienced this one at some point.
Oh, for sure. We've all been there. Nierenberg describes common signs of nervousness like throat-clearing fidgeting. Who hasn't been told to sit still as a kid? And even changes in smoking habits.
So if someone who usually smokes casually suddenly starts chain smoking or nervously putting out their cigarette, that could be a sign they're feeling anxious.
Exactly, especially if it's a departure from their normal behavior. And keep an eye out for those interrupt gestures, like tugging at an earlobe or playing with a necklace. It's like their body's trying to interject even if their words aren't ready yet.
It's like our bodies have this whole secret language they're using to communicate. This is so fascinating. Okay, one last category I want to touch on is self-control. What are some of the ways people try to rein in their emotions through their body language?
This is where Nierenberg's observations get really interesting. He talks about those subtle gestures of restraint, like locked ankles. You often see this in high-pressure situations, like a job interview or even the dentist chair.
Locked ankles in the dentist chair. Okay, now I have to hear more about that.
It's a fascinating observation. Nierenberg shares an anecdote from a dentist who noticed that people often lock their ankles when they're feeling anxious, and get this. The dentist said that when he uses nitrous oxide, he has to ask patients to unlock their ankles so the gas can circulate properly.
Wow, I never would have thought of that. It's amazing how such a seemingly small gesture can have a physiological effect. It really highlights the connection between our minds and bodies. What other self-control gestures should we be on the lookout for?
Nierenberg also describes the gesture of holding the wrist or arm behind the back as if someone is restraining themselves from lashing out. It's such a powerful image of suppressed emotion. It's like they're literally holding themselves back.
It's like our bodies are giving us these subtle warnings saying, hey, something's not quite right here. But Nierenberg doesn't stop there. He takes this gesture reading expertise and applies it to all sorts of real-life scenarios, from telephone conversations to courtroom dynamics, even those casual interactions at social gatherings. It's like he's giving us a masterclass in people watching.
And what I find so brilliant about Nierenberg's approach is that he connects these seemingly mundane behaviors to deeper psychological patterns. For example, have you ever noticed how people gesture even when they're on the phone, even though no one can see them?
Oh my gosh, yes. I catch myself twisting the phone cord, pacing back and forth, even using my hands expressively, all while I'm talking on the phone. So those gestures are just hardwired into us.
Exactly. Nierenberg observes that even when we think we're alone, those dominant behavior patterns still emerge. He talks about people rocking or swinging in their chair during a phone call, which can be a sign of confidence and control. Or think about that classic feet on the desk pose, definitely a power move, even over the phone lines.
You're right. It's like claiming their territory, even in a virtual space.
Ugh.
But moving from the phone to the courtroom, Nierenberg also talks about the nonverbal dynamics at play in legal settings. I imagine the stakes are much higher there, with lawyers trying to sway juries and judges presiding over it all.
Absolutely. And Nierenberg describes how lawyers strategically use gestures to influence the jury, even though those gestures aren't officially recorded. He even talks about how a judge's posture, the simple act of standing or sitting, can subtly impact the jury's perception. It's fascinating to think about those nonverbal cues shaping the course of justice.
It makes you realize that we're constantly sending and receiving these messages, whether we're aware of it or not. And then there's the whole world of social gatherings, parties, networking events, even just hanging out at a bar. The stakes might seem lower, but the nonverbal communication is just as complex.
Nierenberg encourages us to become keen observers in these social settings. He points out those subtle courtship rituals, the preening gestures, how people position themselves to attract attention or signal availability. It's like a whole nonverbal dance is taking place.
He even talks about that classic hunter position at a bar, where someone strategically positions themselves to survey the scene. It makes you want to grab a drink and start analyzing everyone's body language.
It's tempting, isn't it? But beyond the fun of people watching, the Nierenberg reminds us that these nonverbal cues can be especially insightful in professional settings, particularly in superior-subordinate relationships. He talks about those power dynamics at play in the workplace, the subtle ways bosses assert dominance or employees signal deference.
So it's not just about reading your colleagues, but also understanding how your boss's body language might reveal their true feelings about a project or your performance.
Exactly. It's about being attuned to those unspoken messages that can impact your career trajectory.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. Feels like we've only scratched the surface of this fascinating subject.
We have, and that's the beauty of Nierenberg's work. He opens our eyes to this whole hidden dimension of communication that's constantly influencing our interactions.
So as we wrap up, what's the key takeaway you want to leave our listener with?
I think the most important thing to remember is that we're all communicating nonverbally all the time, whether we realize it or not. It's worth paying attention to the cues we're sending and receiving. By becoming more aware of our own body language and that of others, we can deepen our understanding, improve our communication, and maybe even navigate those tricky social and professional situations a little more skillfully.
It's like we've been given a secret decoding ring for human behavior. Now we just have to practice our decoding skills.
And the best part is you can start practicing right now. Pay attention to those subtle cues in your next meeting. Observe the dynamics at your next social gathering. Even notice your own body language when you're on a phone call. It's a journey of self-discovery and social awareness, and it all starts with simply opening our eyes to the power of nonverbal communication.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this fascinating deep dive into the world of nonverbal communication. Until next time, happy decoding.